On September 16th, 1890, Louis Le Prince was getting ready to go back to the United States, where he was going to see his wife and children for the first time in 3 years. He was a French inventor who'd been working in the UK and in France for a while, developing what was potentially the first ever motion picture camera. He may have been the first ever person to shoot a moving picture sequence using a single lens camera, and he was getting ready to demonstrate his invention to the whole world in New York. And then he just disappeared. He was last seen waiting at a train station in Dijon in France after being dropped off at the platform by his brother. But then he just never arrived at his destination in Paris, and no one else on the train, passengers or staff, ever remember seeing him on board. He just vanished into thin air and he's never been seen again. But before we get into the rest of the story, I do want to say a huge thank you to Matchmasters for sponsoring this video. Matchmasters is the world's most popular multiplayer match 3 game, where you can play live against your real life friends, or against people around the world, or by yourself in solo mode. In Matchmasters, all you've got to do is match 3 or more of the same shape and try and get as many points as possible, more than the person that you're playing against. You can play 1v1, you can play different challenges against yourself, you can do rumbles or tournaments where you're playing to become the best of the best and win amazing rewards. This is a very niche fact about me, but I am amazing at match 3 games, and I don't know what it is. It's just like a weird skill of mine. My brain just sees it, like it just sees the board, and I am unbeaten in Matchmasters. Like nobody has beaten me yet. I once won the jackpot prize in a match 3 arcade game on Brighton Pier. Like, do not mess with me. I will beat you at match 3. So of course I have been trying to get all of my friends to download Matchmasters so I can play against them and defend this title as unbeaten. It's no secret that my job researching true crime stories day in, day out can get quite heavy, so I rely on escapism on mobile games to let my mind wander elsewhere, and Matchmasters is perfect for that. It really helps me unwind after a very long day of research. It also helps keep my brain sharp in a very easy, non-stressful way. So, you can download Matchmasters for free right now on iOS or Android if you click the link in the description or scan the QR code that's on screen right now. And you also might get a very special welcome pack full of surprises and advantages when you first open the game if you use my link. So, you should do it. Again, a huge thank you to Matchmasters for sponsoring this video. Like I said, it's completely free to download, so what are you going to be losing by doing it? Nothing. You should download it. Let's go back to the very beginning and talk about who Louis Le Prince was, because he was a really cool guy. You might be a bit confused because as far as most people are aware today, Thomas Edison was the inventor of the motion picture. So who was this Le Prince person? How does he come into the story? Well, just get yourself strapped in because this is all a pretty crazy story and Thomas Edison is highly involved, or so some think. Louis Aimé Augustin Le Prince was born on the 28th of August 1841 in Metz in France. Most of his family did just call him Augustin and English-speaking friends called him Gus, but for the sake of this video we'll just call him Louis because that's what history knows him as. He was the son of a French army officer and his dad had a very good friend called Louis Daguerre who was a French artist and photographer. Growing up, Louis Le Prince spent a lot of time hanging around in Daguerre's studio, learning a lot from him over the years, both in photography and chemistry. Louis Le Prince would go on to receive a lot of education. He was said to be a very, very smart man. He went to Paris to study painting, he studied chemistry at Leipzig University in Germany, and all of this would just lend itself to the knowledge that he needed in the future, his fascination with cameras, his determination to invent the first motion picture. These were all just the building blocks for this. In 1866, aged 25, Louis moved to Leeds here in England to join a very good friend called John Whitley, whom he'd met at college. He worked for the Whitley's family company for a few years, representing their firm in Paris, before marrying John's sister, Elizabeth, who everyone just called Lizzie. The pair had already met in Leeds, and then Lizzie's father sent her to study art in Paris. They reconnected, and the rest was history. They married in July 1869 and settled in Leeds. Louis and Lizzie were a pretty unstoppable pair, and they eventually opened a school of applied art in Leeds called the Leeds Technical School of Art. Louis was obviously interested in photography, Lizzie was also a very talented artist, and they became well renowned for their work combining photography on metal and ceramic. Their work was incredibly well respected throughout England, and they were even commissioned to make portraits of Queen Victoria and the Prime Minister at the time, William Gladstone. It was around the same time they opened the art school in 1878 that Louis saw Edward Muybridge publish his very famous photos of a galloping horse, in which he arranged 12 cameras in a row capturing a racehorse in motion. Muybridge would later copy the photos onto a rotating disc and invented a device which made it look like the horse was moving. Upon seeing this, something sparked in Louis Le Prince, because what if he could actually capture movement on film? Nowadays, this sounds like such a simple concept, doesn't it? Like our entire lives are surrounded by motion picture. TV, movies, TikTok, YouTube, I'm filming this on a camera. Like it's hard to imagine a world where this wasn't an option. But it wasn't at this time, but Louis knew that it could be, and he started pondering, playing around with the idea. In 1882, at which point Louis and Lizzie now have 6 children, John, Lizzie's brother, convinces the couple to move to New York. There was a bit of drama behind the scenes, it seems. Whitley Partners, which was the family company, had fallen into bankruptcy. Louis had borrowed £350 from an acquaintance in Leeds and failed to make the repayments. Like the whole family moving across the pond just seemed to be a very good idea. Once in New York, Louis tried to run an interior design business, which failed. He also managed a small group of French artists specialising in panoramic paintings. But Louis wasn't truly successful in anything because his mind was always elsewhere. It was always on his motion picture machine, an idea he'd been trying to make come to life for years. However, he didn't quite have the funds or the technical knowledge to make it come to life. And the race was very much on here because, of course, Louis Le Prince wasn't the only person to have had this idea of a motion picture camera. There were inventors working on this idea all around the world. It was just a race to be the first one to get there, the first one to register a patent for their invention. After a lot of experimentation, Louis knew that in order to trick the human brain into believing that it was seeing a moving image, a camera would have to take at least 16 pictures every single second. And he did design a camera that had 16 lenses. This would be the first invention of his that he would patent. It was a good idea he had, the logic was there, but the problem was that each lens in the camera was in a slightly different place, meaning that every image was captured from a slightly different angle, and it didn't exactly make for a smooth motion when putting them all together and making them sort of like move in fast motion. Like, kind of think about the idea of like a flip book where you like have little pictures in the corners and you flip through it and it looks like it's moving. That's the kind of idea that Louis was going with here. So yeah, 16 different photos from 16 very slightly different angles. It wasn't smooth, or at least it wouldn't have been smooth if he actually had been able to project these images onto anything. Because for motion picture, you need 2 pieces of technology here. You need the ability to take the photos to capture the motion, and the ability to actually view said photos. And the race was on to be the first one to patent either of these bits of technology. So, in 1887, Louis decides that he needs to return back to Leeds to focus on his work, leaving Lizzie and most of the kids back in New York. Some sources say that Louis was always concerned about his work being stolen, as there was such a race on here to be the first to create motion picture, and his wife would later say that he was always concerned about industrial spies. So he set up a workshop at 160 Woodhouse Lane in Leeds, which is where he got together a team of very trusted people, including his own son Adolf, to work on his camera full time. And they did manage to successfully develop a single lens camera that was capable of taking enough photos in quick succession. And Louis decided to capture his first ever motion at the British Waterways building on Leeds Bridge in October 1888. This was the busiest road in Leeds. It was going to be able to capture a lot of motion. However, Louis quickly realised that there was a rather small flaw with his camera. It wasn't quite as simple as letting the shutter just open and close 16 times a second. The photos were going to be blurry because the film rushing past the lens would be moving during the exposure. And I'm trying to explain this in as simple terms as possible here because it's quite hard for me to get my head around, but hopefully this makes sense. So in order to stop the film from moving so fast and making the photos blurry, he invented a clamp to stop the film before the shutter opened and exposed the image. But then he had to invent a way to stop the film from snapping when the clamp was still on. It was all very complicated, but Louis did it. And then he had to figure out how to project them all in quick succession onto a wall in order to actually create the motion picture. In order to do this, he printed the pictures onto glass slides and then arranged to drop them down a tube in front of a lens. The slides would get caught in the bottom of the tube in a kind of like slotted belt kind of thing, and that would spiral its way up to the top and it would create one continued projection. I hope that makes sense. But overall, this just wasn't a really great way of doing it. So instead, in 1888, Louis invented flexible celluloid film, a flexible plastic sheet on which the photos could be captured and through which they could also be projected. And the invention of celluloid film was huge. Like, it's literally what we think of when we think of motion picture. The first thing ever recorded on celluloid film was a short movie called Roundhay Garden Scene, recorded by Louis Le Prince in 1888. It was shot at Oakwood Grange in Roundhay in Leeds and is of course in black and white, and it pictured the people closest to Louis. In the race to create motion picture, Louis Le Prince had come first. He was overjoyed and wanted to head back to New York to unveil his invention for the very first time. He wrote a letter to Lizzie asking her to prepare a theatre for this big reveal. He had finally cracked it. He packed up all of his cameras and projects and left Leeds for good. But New York wasn't going to be his first stop. First of all, he had some family business to tend to back in France. His mother had died the year beforehand in 1887, and she'd left a 5-story townhouse in Paris that him and his older brother Albert had to sell. And this sad twist of fate was actually what had allowed Louis to create his camera in the first place. He'd been struggling to fund everything, he didn't have any money, but when they got the house, Louis agreed to sell his share to his brother for 60,000 francs, which is just over £500,000 today. It's what allowed him to go over to Leeds to set up the workshop. But now the camera was created, he'd won the race, he could finally go back to France and settle all the family affairs. He made sure that he was granted patents in France and Britain that covered his single lens motion picture camera, and patents were a massive thing in the world of invention. As soon as you create something new, especially in this time in the 1800s, which was rife with invention, you had to get it patented, otherwise you had no protection. Your invention could be stolen and somebody else could make it out to be their own. And this happened all the time. So Louis made sure he had the patents, but there would later be question as to whether they were detailed enough to really dub him as the creator of motion picture. So, patents in place, he went to Paris and on March 30th, 1890, showed his moving pictures at the National Opera. Later sworn by witnesses, this definitely did happen. And it is important to note the dates here because Thomas Edison wouldn't show his first film until a year later in 1891, and Louis had been doing it for years by this point. After Paris, he went to visit his brother in Dijon for a little bit, who was recently widowed, and then on the 16th September 1890, intended to begin his journey back to New York. He was going to catch a train from Dijon to Paris, head to Liverpool via Leeds, and then get a ship back across the Atlantic to New York. But he never arrived. Somewhere along the line, he disappeared, but nobody quite knows where. All we know for sure is that Albert definitely dropped Louis off at the train station in Dijon with his suitcase, which contained all the latest patents and materials for his presentation in New York. Albert waved bye to his brother, and then no one's ever seen him again. Some sources do say that people remembered seeing Louis at the platform, but this is a 134-year-old case, so it's probably safe to say that a lot of the details around this have been lost or misremembered over the years. It seems that what maybe happened is that Louis missed the first train that he was supposed to get, so he was getting a later one than he originally intended. His friends were supposed to be meeting him in Paris, but when he missed that first train, which is kind of what his brother said, they headed off on their own journeys. And this was 1890. They couldn't exactly text to be like, I'm on the next train, wait for me. Like when Louis didn't turn up, they just had to continue on their journey. No one knows if he made that second train from Dijon to Paris. We don't know if he ever turned up in Paris. All we know for sure is that none of the passengers or staff on board that train recalled seeing him. Now, this doesn't mean for sure that he didn't board it just means that no one remembers seeing him. Now, Lizzie and his family knew what ship he was meant to be on, heading back across the Atlantic, and this was going to be a long journey. Like, Louis would have been at sea for weeks. But when the ship arrived at the harbour in New York, Louis was nowhere to be seen. Lizzie and the kids, having not seen Louis in years at this point, waited until the last people walked across the gangway, and Louis never turned up. The people he was supposed to be travelling with did, but not Louis. But the people said not to worry, Louis had been delayed with work, that he'd be on the very next ship. But no one quite knows where they got this idea from. Nobody knows if they actually spoke to Louis at any point in this journey, or if they just assumed that he was held back with work. Again, in this time, even sending a letter could take days, weeks. There was no instant and quick communication. You just had to wait. But then the next ship turned up a few days later, and Louis also wasn't on that one. Whilst things were unsure for a while, it was several weeks until it was decided that Louis was definitely missing. He didn't come on that second ship, or the third one, or the fourth one. He just didn't turn up. Louis Le Prince was 49 years old and he was officially missing. And his suitcase was missing as well, a suitcase which was said to have some very, very important documents in it, his patents. Could maybe that have something to do with his disappearance? Like I said, it took weeks for Louis' family to be really sure that he disappeared, and by the time they took it to the police, they weren't all that interested. Apparently, in this time, the authorities didn't actually have the power to look for a missing person unless said missing person had committed a crime. When Lizzie brought her concerns to the police, they told her that she had to accuse her husband of a crime, and then they'd maybe have some power to look for him. But then, what if he was found? Like, what if they followed through with charging him with a crime? No, Lizzie wasn't about to do that, but there wasn't loads else she could do apart from just sit and wait and talk to whoever she could talk to. But once again, this was the 1800s. It wasn't like she could broadcast his face across social media. All she could do was send letters and wait weeks for the inevitable reply of, sorry, no, we don't know where he is. But Lizzie already had her own suspicions about what had happened to her husband, and she was pointing the finger at one man, and that man was Thomas Edison. Yes, the very same Thomas Edison who is dubbed with inventing the light bulb, and what else? Oh yeah, the motion picture camera. Thomas Edison was very well known in the world of invention for being pretty ruthless when it came to patents. He patented anything and everything, and he would not shy away from suing others for infringing on what he believed was his property, his inventions. It is very well documented that Edison was not well liked by the inventors because of his underhanded tactics and public dishonesty. More than one person accused him of claiming credit and ownership for inventions that he did not create. Edison would get patents in before anyone else had any chance. He had the best legal team around, and he would win. Like, anything that he said he invented, he would win it. His legal team would fight it for him. Like, that was it. There was no arguing it. He was quoted in 1878 as saying, "I don't care so much about making my fortune as I do for getting ahead of the other fellows." Edison and his legal team would file petitions with the patent office to caveat things they hadn't even invented yet, but they intended to invent in the future. According to the Washington Post, in 1910, one of Edison's lawyers estimated that Edison had filed some 120 caveats, embracing not less than 1,500 inventions. This was for everything from electricity to mining to motion pictures. A caveat is basically a legal notice that prevents other people who have an interest in something from temporarily pursuing it. So basically, if somebody had filed a patent to invent something that Edison had already thought of, not invented, but just thought of, the patent office would send out a notice to Edison saying that somebody had activated his caveat number. So then Edison would have 1 year and the information from the patent that somebody else had filed in order to create his own copy. If he couldn't do it in a year, then the other person could do it, but if he did do it, then that was his. So yeah, Edison wasn't the most well-liked man. Rumours flew around the inventing world about all the awful, awful things that he did. But it was never outright criminal. He was never accused of being a murderer. He was accused of stealing ideas and putting in too many patents. It just wasn't good sportsmanship. Not that I think Edison cared, I mean, just look at his legacy. But he was ethically questionable, but he wasn't a criminal. And in terms of the fact that he's now credited for the most part with the invention of motion picture, you've kind of got to bear in mind that this whole situation was 1,000 little discoveries over years. It wasn't just Louis Le Prince and Edison in the race to create motion picture. This had been something people have been working on for years. Every new step, every new discovery brought everyone a tiny bit closer to being the first to present motion picture to the world. For example, there was Edward Muybridge, who had invented the camera shutter, Henry Desiremont, who invented the 12 frames per second camera, George Eastman, who made photo-negative film. There were so many people involved in this story, in this journey to motion picture. Edison, or perhaps his assistant, depending on who you want to believe, was responsible for the invention of the kinetograph, which was a motion picture camera, and the kinetoscope, a peephole motion picture viewer. In 1888, Edison said, "I'm experimenting upon an instrument which does for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear, which is the recording and reproduction of things in motion." But we do know that in that same year, in 1888, Louis had already filmed his Roundhay Garden scene. He'd already created motion picture. He'd created both the 16 lens camera and the single lens camera. Jump forward a couple of years, Louis Le Prince disappears, and then just 8 months after that, Edison would reveal his kinetograph to the world, claiming that it featured pure motion recorded and reproduced for the very first time. But we know it wasn't for the very first time. Louis Le Prince had already done that. It was when Lizzie saw this that she became convinced that Edison was behind her husband's disappearance, and she wanted the world to know that the motion picture camera was her husband's legacy and not Edison. You see, weird things been happening for a bit before Louis disappeared. For example, there was a very strange man who turned up at Lizzie's door a couple of times, asking after her husband and refusing to take no for an answer. The first time was when Louis was still in Europe, but Lizzie knew that he was sort of heading home imminently, and a man knocked at her door, pretending to be selling milk, I think it was, maybe selling something, to which she said she wasn't interested and went to close the door. And only at that point did this man start asking about her husband, showing a little bit too much interest in when he was going to be back in the country. Alarm bells started ringing for Lizzie, who had had it drilled into her by her husband that there were a lot of people out there who were going to want to steal his invention, that he was being followed by spies. I mean, that's one of the main reasons that Louis went back to Leeds, to lock himself in a workshop undisturbed so he could work on his camera away from the so-called industrial spies. Lizzie was under very strict instructions not to share what he was up to with anyone. And then this strange man turns up on her doorstep asking a few too many questions. She did not like this. But then after Louis disappeared, at the point that everyone knew that something was amiss, the same man appears at her door again. This time there are no pretenses, he just straight up asks about Louis, wanting to know where he was. Of course, Lizzie didn't know, she wished she did, but she didn't. And it got the cogs turning. She really thought at this point that Louis had been murdered by somebody who was after his inventions. And then, just 8 months after Louis disappeared, Edison unveils his motion picture. Until the day she died, Lizzie was convinced that Thomas Edison killed her husband in order to take credit for motion picture. But there's never been any actual evidence to prove this. There's never been any evidence to show that Edison did kill Louis Le Prince. It just doesn't really make sense, but Lizzie was always convinced. If they couldn't prove his murder though, the Le Prince family really wanted to prove his legacy. If they couldn't have Louis, they at least wanted him to go down in history as the creator of the motion picture camera. But sadly, there were many roadblocks in the way that stopped them being able to do this. Roadblocks are probably the reason as to why Edison is still widely credited with being the inventor. At this time in the 1890s, there was a law in place that said if somebody went missing and a body wasn't found or they couldn't be declared dead in some other way, All of their property, including intellectual property, was frozen for 7 years, or until a body was found, whatever came first. So for 7 whole years, the Prince family legally couldn't present Louis's motion picture camera. They couldn't license it, they couldn't make money, they couldn't do anything. And a lot happened in this world in 7 years. By the time that Louis was officially declared dead on the 16th September 1897, Edison had already released the kinetograph. The Lumiere brothers invented the cinematograph. Motion picture had made huge steps forward, and anyone involved in this had made a shit ton of money. Whilst the Princes just had to sit and watch from the sidelines. Their hands had been legally tied. They'd completely missed out. Lizzie and Louis' son, Adolphe, did attempt to take Edison to court to annul his claims of inventing the camera, but this was unsuccessful. There was just nothing else they could do. So, the big question, was Thomas Edison responsible for the death or disappearance of Louis le Prince? It doesn't seem so. He definitely took advantage of some very underhanded techniques in the invention world, but there's no other accusations of him murdering people or just discarding them so he could take their ideas. I mean, if Edison wanted to steal somebody's idea, he just did it. Lizzie needed someone to blame for her husband's death, and Edison became that person. But I suppose it's not entirely out of the question that another competitor could have been the one responsible. As I've pointed out, there were multiple people out there trying to invent the motion picture camera. Could somebody else have been the person responsible for Louis' disappearance? Well, maybe, but there's no evidence to suggest it. But maybe. Although this case is hard because there's no evidence to suggest anything. The last thing we know is that Louis was at the train station in Dijon. That's it. There's no leads, no clues, no evidence. Did he get on the train? Did he make it to Paris? Did he even maybe make it to England? We just don't know. It has been suggested by some that maybe he did make it to Paris but then fell victim to street crime. Maybe a group tried to mug him, tried to take his suitcase with his patents in it. He tried to protect it and ended up getting killed. His body quite easily could have been disposed of in the Seine. Maybe it was eventually pulled out, but of course again, it was 1890. News probably wouldn't have got back to Lizzie in New York. The French police probably wouldn't have put too much effort into trying to identify it. I think the gang theory, is quite plausible. Apparently, in 1890, a drowned man was pulled from the Seine, and he did bear a very strong resemblance to Louis le Prince, but no one knew about this at the time because this was only revealed in 2003 when somebody was looking through the Paris police archives. And so many years on, there's no way to confirm or deny if it was Louis. But this man was just drowned though, not attacked, so could it be that Louis ended his own life? It has been brought up over the years that Louis was in quite a bit of personal trouble financially. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, he had borrowed some money, not paid it back, and then escaped the country. There were quite a few people out there who were mad at him. And now he was out of money once more. Like, if this motion picture camera didn't work, he was going to be pretty screwed. So this theory says that he either decided to end his own life or he ran away and started a new life. But I must admit, I don't really subscribe to this because he still had to present his camera, this thing he'd spent his entire life working towards. I might understand this theory a bit more if he'd made it back to New York and the camera failed, he publicly embarrassed himself and then he disappeared. Like, that would make a lot more sense in my mind. But the fact that he had all of this ahead of him, that he'd finally created his life's work, like, why would he run away at this point? Why would he end his life at this point? No, if you were to ask me, Louis le Prince ran into trouble once he arrived in Paris. I think he did get on that train, but no one recognised him. And then he got attacked by a group of people who had no idea who he was, like no idea how this man might have gone on to change the world. There are some other theories out there, one of which was that he was gay, so his family ordered for him to be disposed of, but they spent so many years fighting for answers, so why would they do that? His son, Adolphe, as I mentioned earlier, did fight for his father in 1898, the year after Louis was declared dead. He was called as a witness for the American Mutoscope Company in their litigation with Thomas Edison. It was here in court that they hoped they could annul Edison's claims that he'd invented the motion picture camera, but they were unsuccessful, and 2 years later, Adolphe was also found quite mysteriously dead. Thomas Edison is the one who went down in history as the inventor of the motion picture camera, but in more recent years, Louis le Prince's name is coming up more and more. People are starting to learn his part in the story, but like I said, there were many people involved in this journey to motion picture. Many people involved in the journey for you to be able to be sitting on YouTube watching this video. I say if you're not listening to this on my podcast, you're probably watching this on YouTube. Do I think the Louis Le Prince probably deserves a little bit more credit than he got? Yeah, I'd say so. Over a century on now, and it's looking highly unlikely that this mystery will ever be solved. Like, we will probably never ever know what happened to Louis Le Prince. But in my head, I'm going to tell myself that maybe he was the body pulled out of the Seine in Paris in 1890. It kind of makes sense. I do genuinely think he made it to Paris and then just got in trouble on the streets. I just can't fathom any world in which he would choose to run away at this point in his life. Like, it's such a pivotal point. Like, he was about to present his camera. It was going to be huge for him. Why would he run away right now? It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But I'll be very intrigued to hear all of your thoughts in the comments down below. Let me know, like, what do you think happened to Louis Le Prince? Thank you so much for tuning in today, and of course, a huge thank you to Matchmasters for sponsoring this video. As I always say, I wouldn't be able to keep making this content for you if I didn't have sponsors, so it really means the world if you can go and show your support for them by clicking on the link in the description or on the QR code that I'll have on screen somewhere right now. With that, I will see you in the next one. Bye, guys.